Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. And this is for our class for Thursday, the 19th. And last class was pretty much an introductory class where I talked a little bit about the way that horror film could be studied from an academic perspective. And I also had you watch the documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, which serves as a good overview of the semester. And that documentary is also the companion piece to one of the texts that I had assigned. As you can see in the discussion forum responses, I responded to all of you. You're not required to respond to your classmates. You can if you'd like, much like you would in a face-to-face class, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And that's not to say that there aren't difficulties associated with that documentary. For instance, it's very male centric. You notice the individuals who were interviewed were just about all male, and also it's very Caucasian centric. And there are other documentaries that one I am quite fond of. It's film noir, or I should say horror noir. And it's based on the idea of film noir, and it talks about the Black experience in horror films. We'll talk a little bit more about that as the semester progresses. But still, I think the documentary does a good job of sort of preparing us for watching horror film. And you can see in the notes below and the origins in film Gothic. Basically, horror films started from the Gothic tradition. And if we believe that horror film is a history of anxiety, which I do, and this is illustrated through, I think, a long tradition in literary forms, where we see how cultural myths and traditions and legends are turned into stories. And that said, we know that there are contemporary authors like Stephen King who talks about how the modern day Gothic, now usually known as horror, can also be as subtle and offer as much social commentary. Depends on the piece. Though the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, written in the 1700s, was not a particularly well written piece. This was in England, but it did establish many of the traditions associated with the Gothic, the eerie passageways, mystery that needs to be solved, possible supernatural elements, usually a female in distress and a hero rescues her, some idea of monstrosity or that which is other or alien from, though monster in Latin means to reveal. And I think that these texts and these films reveal a lot about ourselves. And Stephen King talks about in Dance Macabre, which is a novel or a book that I very much recommend. Stephen King is known for his novels, but this is more of a analysis of the horror tradition. He talks a little bit about how, from his perspective, horror examines national phobic pressure points, the fears of the masses, whether they be political or economic or social. And I think that's something that goes all the way back to the Gothic tradition. And the idea of utilizing the skills that we would use in an academic setting, looking for symbolism, representational elements, or allegories, these universal truths. And King divides it up as terror, the most refined, because it requires the use of imagination. And usually, when we talk about Gothic texts like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which of course have become famous through film, then we see that idea of terror. But there's also what Stephen King calls horror, kind of a mid level refinement where it's not entirely of the mind. And then what King calls the gross out. This is the lowest refinement. It basically is about revulsion. And in fact, in the notes below, under the first section, I have a Stephen King article talking about why we crave horror movies, talking about many of the things we talked about last class, about the importance of catharsis, being able to experience difficult emotions in safe ways, And that first Gothic novel in 1764, as I said, not necessarily a particularly well written novel, but establishing what we will see in early horror film and even contemporary horror film. And you can see that I've put a list here of haunted castles and houses, um, decay, decadence, madness. Keep that idea of madness in mind when we are watching The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The past and how the past comes back to haunt the present. Possible supernatural elements, but they can be explained away perhaps through natural explanations as well. Dark and gloomy settings, also this idea of doubling of twos. One film that I do recommend that we aren't reading in class or watching in class, I should say, though basically we're applying the same analytic skills for reading a literary text to these films, is a film by Jordan Peele called Us, which very much confronts the idea of doubling and doppelganger, as it's known as. And yes, this is very genre-like. In other words, it's quite repetitive and it's predictable, but it can also be creative. And think about again how Hollywood has basically universalized many of these figures. We will watch next week Dracula, and that's considered to be the first American horror film. Not necessarily the first horror film, which is why we're starting with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And what we've got in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and many other films are these old Hollywood filmmakers, immigrants basically, using the myths and the superstitions of the old world and ultimately some kind of restoration of order where the other, if you want to think of it from that perspective, is vanquished in one way or another. It may not necessarily be in a way that you find to be satisfying. And if it is true that horror film reflects the either phobic pressure points of its times or a history of anxiety, whatever language you want to use, then we can think about it from a decade perspective, which is how I've put together the class. And the 1920s, and obviously this is a huge oversimplification of the events during these time periods, but the 1920s was known very much for the aftermath of World War One. They also had suffered a pandemic, which is something that we ourselves have experienced. And this sense of death and disfigurement, I think, is very much illustrated in a film like Dr. Caligari, which, according to film critics, for instance, Roger Ebert, a very famous film critic, probably the first feature length horror film. I'll get to that in a moment. The 1930s. And do note that, oh, I'm sorry, the 1920s Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a German film. That is going to change when we get to the 1930s and we get what's considered to be the first American horror film, and that's Dracula. And Dracula very much illustrates some of the way that audiences were seeking escapism from the Depression. This is when basically horror film became pop culture, mainstream. However, there are lots of other themes that illustrate some of the anxieties of the 30s in Dracula as well. And keep in mind that Dracula was based on a novel in the 1800s. So it's something that I talk about in my Gothic literature class. So while the film is very different from the novel, in other ways it's similar to the novel and reflects some of the concerns from the 1800s. The 1940s. And the 1940s, of course, we've got World War II. We've got the idea of abnormal psychology becoming an academic discipline, and the sense that we ourselves are the true monster. I'm going to be illustrating the 1940s with the film called Cat People. Very psychological film, in many ways, very much ahead of its time. In the 1950s, again, an oversimplification, but the concerns about communism and communism taking over democracy. Also, the space age and the threat of the nuclear age and nuclear annihilation. Lots of independent filmmakers during this time period who oftentimes would reflect their own political or social agendas. For the 1950s, we're going to watch a film called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Your text talks about a film called The Thing, which is also a wonderful film to illustrate some of the anxieties of the time. I personally prefer Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and when we get to that point, I'll give some of the reasoning why. A film that very much straddles into another genre, sci fi. The 1960s was a particularly tumultuous decade, if you know anything about some of the social and political movements that were going on during the time. And it was very much seen as this was the collapse of the American dream. And this is my justification for having two films from the 1960s. The first being Psycho. I think it very much is an examination of what happens with isolated suburbia, and also what happens with a over dependence on the nuclear family. And that said, when we get to the ending of the 1960s, we've got Night of the Living Dead, George Romero zombie film that very much is seen, as Romero himself has talked about, a film about uprising and revolution. And definitely the 60s were about uprising and revolution, and a sense of increasing pessimism as well. The 1970s, I'd say, very much was very blatantly examining the taboo in very graphic ways. And I think we can see that with films such as The Exorcist. I guess Stephen King would call that the epitome of the gross out. And I've always said this film, and it's based on a novel, a New York Times bestseller, is misread and misviewed. That while the focus is on the gross out of the possessed girl, it really is about the story of the exorcist, hence the title. And there are two exorcists. When we view it from that perspective, I think we can very much appreciate some of the symbolic and metaphorical messages within the film and the text itself. But I can tell you, in terms of media and popular culture, the way that audiences responded to that film was really unprecedented. It was very visceral, which we will talk about. And then we get to the 1980s, very much a time of at least politically, a return to family values. If you know anything about the president, Ronald Reagan at the time, it was also this sense that anything and everything could be done. It was, it was a sense of selfishness, I suppose, associated with the 1980s, and I think you can see that in the slasher film movement, which we will begin by watching Halloween, which came out in the late 1970s, but I think it prefigured many of the elements of the 1980s, a sense of decadence and also the consequences of that decadence. 1990s and the advent of the internet, and I chose a film that again I think prefigured its time, Blair Witch Project, and it talks about the importance of technology, and particularly grapples with issues about whether or not reality is reality if there isn't some sort of technological proof associated with it. And think about how social media has evolved in our current time. And no one could have anticipated that in the 1990s. This was the early days of the internet. 2000s. And if you know anything about Y2K, there was a concern as we turned to the year 2000 that the computer technology that we were increasingly relying on would become obsolete because computers had not been programmed for the digit 2, which starts the year 2000. They'd only been programmed for the digit 1, illustrating that there really wasn't a lot of forethought about the future The concern being that all of the computer systems would freeze once we moved into the year 2000, and that would be the collapse of our society from a technological perspective. Um, the fact that we're also entering into a new century means that you have the usual concerns about what this can mean from a philosophical or spiritual, religious perspective. Um, so, senses of Armageddon or the ending of society as we know it, I think are very much illustrated, especially in a film called 28 Days Later, which is the film that I've selected for the 2000s, which prefigures in many ways much of what we experienced during COVID 19. So it is very much a cautionary tale. And then the 2010s. And of course, we have at this point elected our first black president and have begun to see some of the backlash associated with that. And the film Get Out, which really inspired the theme for this class, is a wonderful examination of race relations and cultural tensions that unfortunately have only seemed to have been exacerbated over the last several years. So, um, fear goes back to not only some of the early written texts like Beowulf and Macbeth, but also early film images. Is image like a train, let's say in the 1800s, pulling into a station, or even ocean waves. Reputedly, there were individuals who were watching ocean waves on film and found them to be so realistic that they actually took steps back to not be wet by the water. It's sounds ludicrous today when we think about the quality of film, but nobody had ever seen really film beforehand. So when you think about the early days of film, um, even though The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 is credited as the first horror film, I did include a very short horror film from 1896, The Haunted Castle, also known as The House of the Devil. It's a silent and black and white and just a few minutes long, and I encourage you to watch it. And this will give you an idea of some of the way those Gothic conventions sort of found their way into film, supernatural elements, and this eerie, dark mystery that needs to be solved. But when you get to a film like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which truly is a masterpiece, not just because it was the first horror film, but because of German Expressionism, which was a kind of filmmaking at the time that was known for its disjointed, surreal imagery. It's very dreamlike, very bizarre, very shadowy, very symbolic, and very much deals with issues of madness and insanity. Um, you might know best a film that utilizes this technique by the name Nosferatu, which actually is related to Dracula. It's a bootleg version of the Dracula novel, which we'll talk about when we get to Dracula. But that said, I think the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, yes, it is in black and white, and watching a black and white film can be a somewhat different experience. And yes, it is a silent film, and if you've never seen a silent film, that too is a different experience. Now, at the time, what would have happened is that live orchestras would have been playing music in the background. So they wouldn't have had any kind of musical score that would have been audio recorded. So that said, there could have been lots of different musical scores that were played. The version that I was able to find is a remastered version. Of course, you can find this on streaming services. And that said, I always wanted to be able to provide you with a free link whenever possible, just so that ultimately you would have access to the films. We might get to the point in the semester where I won't be able to find free links, but at least at this point, I was able to find a link about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And they try to restore some of the tinting that they used so that even though it was a black and white film, they were able to give some gradients of color. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. We're headed towards minute 19 here. I don't know if you want to stop the video. Certainly you can watch the film and then revisit. But starting at minute 19, I'm going to talk a little bit about the film. So we're almost there now. And One of the, I think, many interesting things about the film, or many of the elements of the film are interesting, but one of the most interesting things about the film is the story frame. We have a story within a story, where we begin with the narrator by the name of Francis, who is telling a story. We almost forget that he's telling a story until the ending. Dr. Caligari has oftentimes been read as a symbol for Germany itself and Germany authoritarian government. And think about that as you consider what you've seen with Caligari, sort of controlling and manipulating what could be the masses, represented by Caesar, this hypnotized servant, basically doing the dirty work of the authoritarian. Caesar is a somnambulist, which means he's a sleepwalker. And the idea that perhaps the German masses were also sleepwalking, not necessarily aware of the reality of their world, and in many ways, prefiguring what would happen with World War II. Um, the film very much embraces this idea of doppelganger, this terrifying ghostly double, which we will see with Caligari, but also see through Caesar. And at one point, Caesar is actually a doll that is put to mislead investigators. Again, this idea of a doubling. And if you think about some of the tensions and anxieties of the 1920s, or particularly from a German perspective, the madness, the fear, the death, and the trauma associated from coming back from the First World War, disfigurement and mutilation, enforced conformity. You think about some of the political and economic repercussions of World War I on the German populace. Economic depression. In fact, some have said that there were so many sanctions against Germany. It was one of the reasons why World War II erupted. Um, Also, concerns about mass industrialization, and the idea of repressing all of this trauma but having it reappear, because a terrifying reality, a terrifying past can never be buried. So there are some twists in this movie. The first twist is that the mystic Caligari ends up being the head of the insane asylum. The second twist is that Francis is insane. So that idea that he's an unreliable narrator, so we can't trust anything that Francis says at this point. So we don't know very much about the reality of this tale of madness and sanity. And if it is indeed true that Francis is insane, then we are looking inside the mind of a madman, explaining how disjointed and confused everything is. Perhaps that's the real terrifying reality, is that we don't know that we're insane, but if we are insane, we see the world from a very different perspective. You can have both arguments at the same time, that Francis is insane, but that Caligari is more than just the doctor in the insane asylum, that he also has mystical qualities associated with him. And the ending is rather ominous when he says that he knows how he's going to cure Francis. So look at these disorienting shapes, this carnival funhouse atmosphere, naturally high stools, painted shadows on the wall, these distorted angles, this disjointed mix of art forms. Just visually, it's quite a beautiful movie. And as I had suggested, if you're going to do a really careful viewing of a film, you would do 3 viewings, the first just for plot, the second for analysis, and the third ultimately to remind yourself prior to writing about or discussing a film. Though I know that 3 viewings might not necessarily be possible, but each time you view a film like Dr. Caligari, you'll be able to appreciate the subtlety of it. It's really a dreamlike fantasy, a psychological mindscape, if you will. And you can see how artistically experimental it is and how it influenced contemporary filmmakers. So that if you know Tim Burton, for instance, he was very much influenced by the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's no mistake that Caesar, for instance, looks a lot like Edward Scissorhands, which is a Tim Burton film. And that said, that story frame of Francis at the beginning and the ending of the story was added on after the fact. And many have critiqued that addition, talking a little bit about how without that addition, what you've got is a direct social commentary. But with that addition, it waters it down over the possibility that perhaps Francis can't be trusted. So we can't necessarily trust the narrative. If we could trust Francis and we could trust the narrative, then what we would end up seeing is not having that story frame and a direct commentary against German authoritarian government. So the filmmakers were reputedly pacifist, so it would make sense that they would give us that kind of story that would be critical of political indoctrination. One of the major questions in the film is about who exactly is the enemy, and that also is a major question in terms of war. Now, while you're watching this silent film, you can expect some overacting. That would have been a convention during the time period because, of course, you can't articulate things by being able to speak. So it will seem very removed from contemporary film in that respect. Um, the idea of the cinematic techniques makes it very distinctive from American films, which we will see when we get to a film like Dracula. Um, and also, some have suggested this film illustrates the German subconscious need for authority. We'll see whether or not you agree or disagree with that assessment as you are watching the film. I always love the idea of a cabinet. You know, if you know anything about the Cabinet of Curiosities, which were cabinets that existed that basically were supposed to hold, well, curiosities, these elements that could be otherworldly or supernatural. I like the idea of a cabinet representational of the subconscious, that what is beneath the surface, particularly if we're going to read this as a political allegory, or you can think about a cabinet as entrapment and the feeling that the German people feel trapped after World War One. So, as I indicated, next class we're going to see Dracula, and I wanted to include a link. This is in the notes below under the 7th section. So that if it turns out that you wanted to see it early, you can. But my thinking is that Dracula will be the film that you see next week, and that The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the film that you see this week. And our attendance question about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is due 48 hours after this video. So that's on the 21st of Saturday. And of course, if you need an extension, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant it to you. What did you think of that ending of Dr. Caligari, and why? As I indicated, that ending was not part of the original film. It was added after the fact. And you also have your first journal due. You weren't required to write a journal on our documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, because I saw that as introductory material. But now that we're actually watching horror film, then I'm asking for a journal, about a page or so of your own reflections about the film. It could be some of the notes that you took during the film. It could be an element that you want to examine in further depth with the film. It could be some of the ways that you think the film illustrates with some of the readings we're talking about. It could just be questions that you have about the film as well. Sometimes the questions are more interesting than the answers. So there are lots of different ways you could proceed with a journal. It should be more than plot summary, though. It should be more than just explaining what happened in the film. It's more important to talk about why those things happened in the film and what they could suggest or could represent. And you can write as much or as little as you like. Most students end up writing about a page or so. And I ask that you send that to me via PDF to my email. This is how my grading program works best. PDF via email. And my email is ruiz, RUIZ, @gcc.mass.edu. I will be evaluating evaluating that informally. So basically, not reading for grammar or mechanics, basically just content. You can think of it as our having a kind of conversation on paper. Because I'm grading it informally, it'll be graded on a check mark system, with a plus being an excellent, with a check plus being a very good, with the check being satisfactory. That's where most of the grades range, but there also is a check minus, less than satisfactory, and a minus unsatisfactory. And now for the rest of the semester, you'll be doing journals on all of the films that we will be watching. So much like the class discussion form that's due in 48 hours, your journal is also due in 48 hours. So that'll be Saturday, the 21st. Though, of course, you can always ask for an extension if you need an extension. We'll be doing this over the course of the entire semester, so that basically you will have journals or informal reflections about all of the films. That will definitely come in handy for our final exam, which will be open book, open notes, and will be an essay exam, though you have choice within the prompts. But certainly you can use information from your journals, and you'll see that I will be responding back as if we were having conversation on paper. What will also be very useful for your final exam are the discussion forum responses that you give and your peers give, and my responses to those, because you can utilize all of that for the final exam. So it all fits together. The one piece that we haven't really talked about very much is the idea of the final project, and I wanted to touch base a little bit more about that next class. But at this point, I think I'll just leave you with the film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and certainly watch it as many times as you're able, because each viewing is going to bring forth new meaning and new interpretation. And if you've never seen a silent film, my suggestion is that it requires a certain level of attention that you probably don't need to devote for most films. You really have to watch everything on screen in order to be able to appreciate it. So that's it. I hope you enjoy The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and we'll talk a little bit more about it next class and why it might be considered the first horror film, and we'll also talk about the first American horror film, Dracula. I hope you're well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.